Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 5. The big gasoline lamp on the top of Rob's desk laid a circle of brightness on the gloom of the room and enclosed them both. Nell sat with one foot under her. Her fine, narrow head was bent over her work, and her hair shone like fawn-coloured satin in the lamplight. She had been careful of her hands with their long pointed fingers and almond-shaped nails, and they were as smooth as the brown eggs that came from the Rhode Island red hens. When she talked, she gestured with them, and they had that artless look, the lack of any clutch or grasp, the question in the bent back, reaching fingertips, which always suggests a poetic nature. Rob often watched them, thinking that they moved like something that was helpless, seaweed floating. Ken had the same hands. They didn't take hold, but now, weaving the blue wool in and out the torn saddle blanket, Nell's hands were quick and deft. Between stitches, she glanced at her husband. His round head, with the tight cap of black hair, had the hardness of a profile on a coin. Presently she said, "Rob, give Kenny a colt." Rob made no answer. He might not have heard. Sitting at his desk, before him a pile of bills and a scratch pad on which he was jotting figures. He was silent and absorbed. Bills, thought Nell. I wonder which one, particularly. He's worried these days. Always figuring. Always accounts. He hates it too. Hates figures as much as Ken hates them. Never used to do it. This thought escaped into speech. You never used to keep so many accounts, Rob. This got an answer. As his pencil jotted down a total and scored a heavy line, he leaned back with a short laugh. Never knew I'd have to. He stretched wearily, then reached for the pipe lying on the ashtray, and opening his penknife, he began to scrape it out. Are we broke? We're just 2 jumps ahead of. His voice trailed into silence, and Nell's eyes flitted wildly for a moment, as if she would find the pursuing menace lurking in some dark corner of the house. But haven't we always been? Is it any worse? She asked. He grinned a little. For a long time I didn't know it. And he took out his tobacco pouch. Know what? That each year I was worth less money instead of more. Is it really like that, Rob? It is. A rancher or a farmer can't know whether he is operating at a profit or a loss unless he makes a very careful yearly inventory. I read that in a government bulletin once. That's what pulled me up. You can see why it's true. Equipment deteriorates, buildings run down, there are stock losses, indebtedness increases, but it's all so gradual. Almost imperceptible. A man doesn't notice it. He drifts along, thinking that things are about as they always were. You see it all around here. Some poor devil trying to renew a loan or get a new one he badly needs, and finding out he hasn't got anything left that the banks will lend on. He's been on the downgrade for a long time and never knew it. It hits him all of a sudden. He's a bankrupt, and the day before, he thought he was a capitalist. Well, I take the trouble now to know where I stand. And is it? Are we on the downgrade? We are. But we're more and more careful all the time. We spend less, don't have as much help. Why? We're actually stingy. In the beginning, I still had some capital. What was left over when I bought the ranch? I was going to save that. Should have. It would have sent the boys to college. But now that's gone. Of course, I thought that when I got the horses well started, when they were of an age to sell, I'd make it all back and more. But expenses always keep ahead of me. With so many purebred horses, for instance, and more coming all the time, there are such walloping taxes. This always made Rob angry. It's a cockeyed law to put high taxes on registered stock. It ought to be the other way round. They ought to tax out of existence this run-down mongrel stuff that Wyoming is full of. It would be better for the state if they did. I wish I had nothing but registered horses. These colts of Gypsy and the Albino have put a bad strain into my stock." He sat scowling for a moment, and then said, "The worst thing of all is, I can't sell my horses at a profit. Not even at cost, most of the time." This struck a chill through Nell. Everything depended on the horses. "Perhaps the markets will get better," she said, but her voice reflected the fear in her heart. Rob struck the back of his hand angrily on the desk. "A thing like this, Doc Hicks' bill, this gets me. He can't help it. I'm not blaming him, but here it is. 3 visits at $15 each. And even then, the mare died." He leaned back and puffed at his pipe, and Nell darned in silence. "Bad enough to pay veterinary bills when they get well, although you don't know if you'll ever sell the animal for enough to pay you back for all his cost. But when they die, I'll not do it again. Sick or well, they can take their chances. They get well when you do nothing for them and give them up. They die when you get the vet and nurse them." Often, when Rob talked like this, a tide of fear rose in Nell's heart. It was almost panic. "Oh, Rob, what'll we do? If you'd only stayed in the army, if you'd only never bought the ranch. But you would have it. You're like Ken. When you set your heart, you can't give up, just because you were so crazy about horses and such a fine rider at West Point." Her eyes were hidden from him. Lids down, she watched the thread weaving in and out of the blue blanket, and there was no tremor of her hands to show him that she was frightened, had been frightened for years. "Doc'll have to wait for his money," said Rob. "I'll owe it to him, and some more added to it. I've got 9 2-year-olds for him to geld." "When's he coming?" "Sometime this week. I told him to come any day. I've got the colts in. Poor devil. I don't see how he lives. Nobody pays him. Nobody can afford to." "Rob, does anybody make money ranching?" He shook his head slowly. "Not anymore. Used to. When there weren't any fences, no taxes to pay, when they ran their beef on public lands, the big beef barons of the early days, that's when the fortunes were made in cattle. Not anymore." "But Charlie Sargent, surely he makes money with his racehorses." "Now and then a killing, perhaps, a lucky break, but by and large he's spending money, not making it. He inherited his money. Now he's spending it the way he likes the best, raising racehorses." "What about sheep?" "There's money in sheep if you have the right sort of land for it. In the good years, that is, and when the market is right. But it's a big gamble. You can make a lot, and you lose a lot. The ranchers that are raising sheep now, they're a new bunch. Came in with fresh capital. I met Somerville in the Stock Growers Bank. We got to talking. He said nobody in Wyoming makes money any more except the dude ranchers. And he knows," added Rob grimly. "Then why, said Nell, and hesitated to finish her sentence. Again she felt the panic rising. "Why are we here, trying it?" said Rob. "Well, I still think horses are the best bet." Like Kenny, thought Nell. One idea in his head, and he'll never give up. A well-bred, well-trained, registered 4-year-old horse is worth at least twice as much as a prime steer, perhaps 4 times as much. It's true that a horse eats twice as much. On the same piece of land you can only run half as many horses, but if there were decent markets for hybrid stuff, you might make money. Trouble is, the markets. The army seems the only sure market. Sure, but they don't pay enough. At the army remount depot, it costs them nearly $1,000 to raise a colt to 4 years. They pay us ranchers $150 or $175. You can't even get back the cost of production at that figure. Polo then? Polo's the only hope. For a well-trained polo pony, you can get anywhere from $200 to $2,000. But you've got to sell them as individuals, under the saddle, not in carloads. And I haven't any connections, no one to show them and promote sales. When the boys grow up, that's it. Howard and Ken. With the start they've got, they'll be crack riders. They can be polo players. Show and sell, and then, Nell... Rob turned his eyes to her. They had such burning intensity. She almost expected to see them glow in the dark, like cat's eyes. She gathered up her sewing to put it away, and the little brown cat, squeezed down by her side in the armchair, moved, stretched, and turned over on her back, mowing. "What's your hurry?" asked Rob. "I've finished my mending." "Stick around. I've just got a little more to go over here." He laid down his pipe, picked up his pencil again, and Nell leaned back in her chair. Poorly on her back closed her eyes. Nell's hand sank into the soft cream-coloured fur on her belly. Nell began to fall asleep. She was going down, floating deeper, delicious. She roused herself with an effort. Rob put out his hand and clasped her arm. "Don't go. I'll be asleep if I don't, and I've got to set the sponge for tomorrow's baking. I wish you wouldn't bake. Do as all the other country people do. Eat out of cans. Buy your bread at the Safeway in town. That stuff, made of sawdust blown up. No taste, you could blow it across the room. I don't want you to work so hard. It isn't much. The boys love it. And so do I. And I do myself. But you do too much. Bad enough for me to be slaving, not you." Nell got up and poorly hit the floor with a little grunt. "You come in when you've finished." She went into the kitchen where one kerosene lamp was still burning, hung on the wall by the big black coal stove. Rob finished his figures, closed his book, put it away, and leaned his head on his hand, tapping with his pencil absent-mindedly on the blotter. He had caught a frightened look on Nell's face when she was sitting there sewing, and it haunted him. "And I didn't tell her the half of it," he thought. "I shouldn't ever have done it. What a life for her. I won't quit. I quit the army. Now the ranch. No. Not licked yet. Not by a damn sight. Boys growing up. Howard's a help already. Ken. Now what am I going to do with that little son of a gun? Could have shaken the teeth out of his head today. Never can be where he ought to be. Run an errand and get back on time, do a little job right, or remember what he's told." "Give him a colt," Nell said. "Give him a colt because he damn near stampeded the whole broodmare bunch over the rock slide. If it hadn't been for Banner, great guns, what a horse, ahead of me all the time. If he passes it on to the colts, what kind of headwork, and the heart and the courage, what polo ponies I'll have. That's one thing that's gone right. The blood in my horses, all but the albino strain. That loco brute Rocket, always out in front with her nose in the air looking for trouble. And the three others, she's the worst. Not one of them really broke. I ought to shoot 'em all. I would, too, if they weren't so damn fast. Now I wonder what she meant by that give him a colt. I'd like to. Got to get closer to the kid some way. Every time I'm all set for a get-together session with him, he hands me a facer like this thing he pulled today. I want to give him a colt, and he makes me give him a bawling out. He doesn't mean it, wants to please me. I can see that. Looks to me sometimes as if he was afraid of me. Don't like the way he turns his head away and looks down. Never comes to me for help. That's bad. He ought to turn to me. My fault somehow. Or else he's just at an impossible age. But Howard wasn't. Got to get friends with him. Maybe this summer. Rob got wearily and stiffly to his feet, stood in thought a moment, then put out the gasoline desk lamp and walked into the living room. He called through the dining room to Nell. "I'll be there in a minute. Don't go away. I've got to go up to the bunkhouse," and went out the front door and turned to the right. Overhead the sky was clear, but in the southwest the heavy bank of clouds was spreading. Unless the wind rose again and scattered it, they'd have a storm. As McLaughlin approached the bunkhouse, he could see light burning inside. He pushed open the door with a clatter and crossed the dark kitchen to the living room. Here, Gus and Tim were seated at the long table on which burned 2 kerosene lamps. Gus was mending a bridle. Tim was drawing a picture. copying from a poster propped on the table. Before him was a bottle of Indian ink, and in his hand a drawing pen. Tim's ambition was to be a sign painter. The picture was of a voluptuous hipped young woman, sitting on the end of a bench, looking coyly sideways at a youth on the other end. The room was already lavishly decorated with Tim's drawings, all of them, apparently, images of the same seductive female in different poses. "Hello, boys. Hello, boss. I was just thinking." McLaughlin paused. His eyes were fixed absently on Tim's face, which was a rich dark colour from dirt or sunburn or both, and wore its habitual expression of comic mystification. Tim was always expecting a laugh, but never knew why. "What's that bridle, Gus?" "The one Ken busted this morning," said the Swede. "I left Rocket in the stable pasture. She broke away from the gang just there at the gate to the county road, raced along the fence, hell for leather. The rest of them were going through nicely, and for once none of them followed her, and she was out of sight in a minute. Dot mare. I closed the gate and went on with the bunch. Left her inside. It's just as well. I've got to get her into the chute and get that noose of rope off her neck, or she'll hang herself one of these days. I can do that tomorrow, and then put her out, and she'll find her way up to the bunch alone. See that the gates into the home pasture and the corrals are kept closed. I don't want her to get out. Where's the mare Ken was riding this morning? Cigarette? I caught her up and put her into the home pasture," said Tim. "Thought Ken would be wanting her again." "That's all right then. Good night, boys." Rob went back to the house. Nell was still in the kitchen. He sat down in the corner at the table and took out his pipe. "Well, what about Ken and that colt?" Nell wet a clean cloth at the faucet, wrung it out, folded it in a big square, laid it over the yellow bowl with the sponge, and set the bowl on top of the warming oven. Then she seated herself on the edge of the table, clasped one knee, and looked at Rob. "I want you to give him a colt." "He doesn't deserve one." "What's that got to do with it? Aren't you ever going to give him a colt?" "Sure I am. I've been expecting to." "Well, why don't you then? I told you he doesn't deserve it." "But Rob, he never will." "Why won't he? Howard did." "Ken's different. He's so far behind now, it's hopeless. If you wait until he catches up, and he really has it coming to him, he just won't get one at all." Rob ruminated. "If he attends to his studies this summer—" "That's another thing, Rob. That isn't going to get anywhere." Rob's expression of shock and consternation were almost comical. "Not going to get anywhere? For goodness sake, that's what I'm counting on. Why won't he? He really can't study. He hasn't the habit." "Didn't he study today?" Nell laughed. "He exposed himself to his books." Rob got up and walked up and down the floor. "But my goodness, I've told him to. I've given the order." Nell kept discreetly quiet. Of all the manoeuvres that were difficult for Rob, a right about face was the most difficult. After a while she said, "Let's try a different method. Ken needs to succeed at something. Howard's too far ahead of him, bigger and smarter, and his wits about him, and Ken doesn't half try, doesn't stick at anything, but he's crazy for a colt of his own. He can't think of another thing. But Nell, it's all backwards. You can't bribe children to do their duty." "Not a bribe." She hesitated. "No, what would you call it?" She tried to think it out. "I just have the feeling Ken isn't going to pull anything off." She looked across at Rob. "And it's time he did. It isn't the school marks alone. But I just don't want things to go on any longer with Ken never coming out at the right end of anything. I'm beginning to think he's just dumb. He's not dumb. This thing he pulled today, stampeding the mares, you know he didn't mean to. That's just the point. It's stupidity and carelessness. Nothing I say to him makes any impression. He still goes around wool gathering, not knowing where he is or what's going on around him. Maybe a little thing like this would turn the trick. If he had a colt of his own, trained him, rode him. But it isn't a little thing. It's not easy to break and school a colt the way Howard has schooled Highboy. I'm not going to have a good horse spoiled by Ken's careless ways. He never knows what he's doing. If Ken could really accomplish something like this, it would make a big difference in him. That's a big if. Rob, it's important. He's got to get square somehow. The way he looked tonight, hung dog, sullen almost, he's in everybody's bad graces. What he really needs is to snap out of it. Well, if you want to put it that way, I was going to say he needs to grow up a little. How will having a colt make him grow up? Well, you know, something of his own, responsibility. You see, he'd have something real in flesh and blood that he cared about more than all the things he goes mooning about. If he achieves anything with the colt, I think it'll show in everything he does next year. He'll be more of a man. She took off her apron. They put out the kitchen lamp, went down the step into the living room, and Rob called, "Here, Kim. Here, chaps." Reluctantly, the dogs rose from their mats, stretching themselves, yawned, and followed Rob and Nell out onto the terrace. 4 dark horse shapes took fright and leapt away from the fountain, galloped off a little, then turned and stood, watching curiously. Rob and Nell led the dogs away around the corner of the house and put them into the tool shed. Returning, they sat down on the coping of the fountain. The horses were coming back, a few steps at a time, their ears pricked. "Which are they?" asked Nell. "The 3-year-old broncs." Nell said nothing. The fact that they had been left here, in the home pasture, which was just a ring of barbed wire fence about a half-mile in area, enclosing a section of woods, hills and fields around the ranch buildings, meant that they were at hand for use. He was going to break them. "But not if I know anything about it," said Nell to herself. 4 of the mares haven't foaled yet. I think Rocket's dry this year, Rob said. "I thought Rocket had foaled already. A black horse colt. The other day when I was down in the meadow, there was a black horse colt that I thought was hers. A little new one." "I thought so too. But when she made that break away from the bunch today, there was no colt following her. But I saw it nursing. Must have been nursing on one of the other black mares. This time of year, when their coats are so rough, it's hard to tell them apart. Rob, I'm sure it was Rocket." Rob suddenly got to his feet. Nell knew the thought of a colt left down there in Castle Rock Meadow, perhaps hidden somewhere in the aspen grove at the far end, perhaps hurt, would worry him. "But I rode all through the aspen grove," he said. "I didn't leave any colts behind. Besides, if she had a colt, Rocket wouldn't have left it. You never can get her away from her colts." He sat down again on the coping and watched the horses that were coming towards him, step by step. "I'll drive down to the meadow tomorrow and take another look." The 4 horses kept their eyes fixed upon him. They knew him, the smell of him, the look of him. At the sound of his voice, if it came from half a mile away, every horse on the ranch stopped in his tracks and looked around. They stood in a half circle in the moonlight facing him. "They want oats," said Rob. "I haven't got any oats, you beggars." He raised his arms, flapped them, yelling, and the horses leapt and galloped away into the darkness. Rob and Nell laughed. The moon was well up, huge and theatrical above the black pine branches on the hill. The green was in shadow, just the tips of the cottonwoods catching the light. They sat in silence, watching the moon climb. More and more of the cottonwoods rose into the light, floating softly. "They're like ballet girls," said Nell, dancing on the green. The horses were returning. Very slowly they came close and made a ring, watching Rob. In the bunkhouse, Gus yawned and put away his work. "Give us a tune, Tim, while I finish my pipe. Then I'm turning in." Tim wound the little gramophone, inspected the records carefully, chose one and put it on. Seated again, his chair tilted against the wall, Tim leaned his head back and both men were silent. The tune spun out on the clear night air and reached Rob and Nell sitting on the coping of the fountain. It was an old song, with all the childish pathos of the melodies that are loved on the plains, or born there, and seemed to come from a voice singing far away. "Darling, I am growing old. Silver threads among the old shine upon my brow today. Yea, yea, life is fading fast away. The song ended. Gus sighed. The needle spun round and round, finally grinding on the record, and Tim got up and turned it off. That's the end of chapter 5. Good night. Sleep tight.